All right. So the first things that we're always taught in geometry are known as undefined terms. It's a little bit silly to think about undefined terms as a concept, but essentially these don't have a formal definition. We just all have kind of an agreement of what they are. It's kind of difficult to represent a point in space, but we've come to an understanding of what a point is and how to represent it. That's why it's called an undefined term. So it's a term that isn't defined, but we have an agreed upon sort of definition on it. So the first thing about a point, it has no dimension, and we always represent it with a dot and a capital letter. Not a lowercase letter, a capital letter. And those things will make a difference in our labeling. So anytime I am noting a point on a diagram, I can label it with a capital letter as such. Has no dimension. We've graphed points before on the XY axis, and we're going to talk about the XY axis as a plane here in a minute. A line, similarly, has one dimension. It's also an undefined term. It's represented by a line with two arrowheads, and it extends without end. One of the things that you need to know that makes a line different than a ray or a segment, obviously, is that it goes forever in either direction. It extends without end. The way we note that is using any 2 points on the line. So it could be AB, it could be BA. The only important thing there is that you do put those arrowheads when you're annotating that, to indicate that you're talking about a line as opposed to a segment or a ray. And later on in the semester, I'm extremely harsh about that just because, again, those things are very different in geometry. One of the postulates that you need to know that we've kind of discussed, I think, in Algebra 1 is that 2 points make a line. And you can always make a line through any 2 points. So if I use a different color here, and I have point C and point D, I can always draw a line through those points, and I can label that line CD with arrowheads or line DC in reverse with arrowheads. Now you can't always do the reverse. It depends on the shape that you're discussing, okay? Now, the other way you can label a line is with a lowercase letter. You can just call the entire line, in this case, line L, and they typically use a cursive L to indicate that. So far we've learned of 3 different ways to name a line. You can name a line with just the lowercase letter. You can name a line with any 2 points forward, so line AB with the arrowhead on top, or backwards, line BA with the arrowhead on top. Do you have any questions on the first 2 undefined terms in geometry? Okay, a plane is very, how can I say this? It's a conceptual sort of topic and something that you have to really visualize. So a plane has 2 dimensions. It's represented by a shape that looks like a floor or wall, but it extends without end. One thing that your book doesn't do is really explain planes very well. When you're first learning about planes, you always see, or students seem to think that planes always look like this rhombus type shape, and that's not always true, okay? So planes can also look like triangles as long as they're flat surfaces, okay? They are flat surfaces that extend forever without end. That's the other thing that people forget. They think that a plane stops here and here, but really it goes on forever this way, and forever this way, and forever this way, and forever this way. So that's the first part of planes, what it looks like. Again, it can be represented by another shape as long as it's a flat shape. It says through any 3 points not on the same line, and this is really important, not on the same line. I'm going to underline that. There is exactly 1 plane. you can use 3 points that are not on the same line to name a plane. And this is true with any 3 points not on the same line. So, for example, we have point A, and here we have point C. We know that we can draw a straight line through point AC that passes through point AC, correct? Now, if I want to name this plane, and let's say I draw a line here, and there's some other point, and you don't have to write this down, there's some other point D out here. I could not name that plane DAC. Why? Because they're all on the same what? They're all on the same straight line. Does that make sense? I could name this plane ABC, because even though A and C are on the same line, and A and B are on the same line, they're not all on the same line together. Does that make sense? So again, planes are a little bit confusing. Do you have any questions about what I talked about as far as what points are and lines are and planes are and how to name them? The other way you can name a plane is just by one capital letter. So lines we can name with a single lowercase letter, and planes we can name with a single capital letter or by 3 points not all on the same line. All right. Here we go. So I'm picking up the recording here. So we're talking about collinear points and coplanar points. Co meaning together, right? So, for example, if you play a game together, usually you can go on co-op mode, right? So co meaning together. Collinear points are points that are all on the same line. So as you can see, if I can draw a line through any 2 points, I can draw a line through points A and B, and those are considered collinear. The same can be said about A and C. I can draw this vertical line through AC, and those are also considered to be collinear. Now, they're not all on the same line, but they are all on the same plane, and that is the XY plane, or the XY axis, that we learned about in Algebra 1. So because they're not all on the same line, one's on the red, you have 2 on the red line and 2 on the blue line, and I can also draw a line here. So these are all different lines. I can use all 3 points to label this plane. I can call it plane ABC, or just call it the XY plane as it's more commonly referred. So that also takes care of coplanar points. Those are points that lie in the same plane. Since A, B, and C lie in the same plane, they are considered to be coplanar. So points A and B are what we consider to be collinear, because they lie on the red line together. A and C are collinear, C and B are collinear, and A, B, and C are coplanar. Questions on points, lines, planes, collinear points, and coplanar points? Anyone still writing? All right, we will take a break pretty soon here. What's one way I can name, it says give 2 other names for PQ. What's another way I can name that line? QP. I can name it QP. That's one way. What's another way? Line N. Right. With that lowercase letter. Oops, it's still on freeze mode. Let me unfreeze it. There you go. So line QP with the arrowheads, or line N with just the lowercase letter. questions on that first bullet point? Okay, it says name 3 points that are collinear, name 4 points that are coplanar. Oh, I have to also name plane R in a different way. So what's another way I can name plane R? Well, I'll start. SP what? SPV, right. S and P are on the same line, that's fine, but V is not. So that's okay to name it SPV. I couldn't name it SPT because those are all on the same line. So one way to name it is SPV. So I can name this plane SPV. What's another way I can name plane R? What about PVT, right? PVT. P and T are on the same line, but V is not. So plane PVT is another way. These are just possibilities. You don't have to list all of them. I want you to give me one more without me assisting you. Any thoughts? SVT. Plane SVT. If we take a look here, S and T are on the same line right here, but V is not. So I can use those 3 points to name that plane. All right, because it was kind of silent in here, are you sure you don't have any questions on naming planes? All right, you're just a shy group, that's fine. Okay, so it says now name 3 points that are collinear, name 4 points that are coplanar. So take a moment, work with someone near you, and try to figure out the answers to that bullet point. What are 3 points that are collinear and 4 points that are coplanar? What did we come up with? What are our 3 points that are collinear? Yes. Yeah, SPT points S, P, and T are all collinear. Okay, name 4 points that are coplanar. Yes. Yeah, they're all coplanar. Can we use all 4 points at once to name the plane? No. We name a plane with how many points? Anyone? 3. And those 3 points cannot all lie on the same line. So I can name it, like we said before, SPV, PVT, SVT. Even though all those points are on the same plane, I can't use all those points at once to name the plane. So I couldn't say plane SPTV. I don't want to do that. They're all coplanar, but that's not a proper line. That's not a proper name for the plane. Are you good? Confused? Yes? Okay, cool. The other thing I wanted to show you that's outside of your book is just a couple different ways, again, that we can see planes here with our shapes. So we have a cube, like an ice cube. Of course, you have the floor of the cube. That is the plane. Notice I used 3 points to name that plane DCB. But then I could also draw lines above here and create another plane, right? Which I did right there. So you also have a plane HGB, and HG, B, and A are all coplanar. Questions? Okay, excellent. I'm gonna pause. So you can name it SP. What's another way you can name it? Any other ways? PS, right. You know that it's going to go forever in either direction, so you could name it PS as well. Questions on naming that line? You just need 2 points on the line to name it. Name a point that is not coplanar with Q, S, and T. What'd you come up with? Do you have a guess? Well, V, and I'll tell you why. When they're talking about the coplanar points Q, S, and T, that looks a little weird because you're probably thinking, how is that coplanar when Q is all the way up here? Well, because, what did I say? Planes don't have to be those rhombus-looking or rectangular-looking flat surfaces. You could extend it above in this triangle shape. So that triangle is also a separate plane, STQ. So that triangle is a plane that we label STQ. So something not on that triangular plane is point V. Does that make sense? Yeah, so we have a couple different planes that we're looking at here, not just the one that we see. All right. The other thing I want to make you aware of before we take our little break is these dotted lines. Typically with those dotted lines, we include them when it extends beneath our shape. So I have this pencil up here. When you're drawing it or sketching it out, you can draw a solid line above, and anything that goes below it that's not in plain view, in a 2D view, you want to put a dotted line. Does that make sense? So you'll see that a lot, and those dotted lines represent those parts that we can't see from a 2D view or that may go beneath the surface of the shape. Okay, so you can take a little bit of a break. I'll give you 3 minutes. You can stretch, check your phones, do whatever you need to do, catch up on notes, and then in 3 minutes we will continue on. All right. So now we've talked about undefined terms. We're going to talk about defined terms. Basically, defined terms are defined by undefined terms. So we use undefined terms to create definitions for our defined terms. So we have segment and ray and opposite rays. So let's take a look at that. We talked about lines and how they're represented with double arrowheads. This is why the way you label things is extremely important. Line segments are labeled differently than lines are. If I'm going to label this line segment, I'm going to label it, for example, line segment AB. I know it's a line segment because it's just going to have a segment without the arrowheads. Just like before, when I labeled my line, I can switch the order of this, and that's fine. I still know what segment I'm talking about as long as I have that solid line above AB or BA to indicate that I'm not talking about a line. I'm talking about a segment that ends at those points, A and B. Those are end points. It doesn't go any further than that. Ray is very different, okay? So with a ray, one of the most important things that you need to remember with a ray is that order matters. Whereas we could reverse with our lines and our segments, we cannot do the same with our rays. Why? Because we could be talking about opposite rays, rays that are not the same at all. So it says, the ray AB, written AB with it's kind of like a segment line mishmash, you have just the single arrowhead. That tells me that you have a ray. Okay, that's different than ray BA. Ray AB and ray BA are different. So what ray AB tells me is I have an endpoint at A, and it extends forever in B's direction. What ray BA tells me is that I have an endpoint B, and it extends forever in A's direction. Okay? So, let's look at this. It says the ray AB consists of the endpoint A and all points on line AB that lie on the same side of A as B. So just that one side of your line. That's what that means. Note that AB and BA are different rays when we label them as such with that single arrowhead. Now, why is it important that we are very consistent and we are meticulous with this labeling? Because we could be talking about opposite rays. It says if point C lies on AB, line AB, between A and B, then ray CA and CB are opposite rays. So you can see CA is talking about this part of your line here in blue. That part there. That is a different ray than ray CB, which is this ray. Believe it or not, they have a very similar question on your final exam for first semester, and this was one of the most missed problems, was the opposite rays problem. So just keep that in mind, that CA and CB are opposite rays. That starting point C, or that starting point B or A, those are your end points. Does that make sense? That's that end point. The thing that follows it, the B in this case, the A in this case, the B in this case, and the A in this case, that's what, as far as your ray is concerned, goes forever in that direction with that point included. Any questions about rays and segments and opposite rays and definitions, etc.? Yes? You can. So, like I said, you can point the arrow to the left, but you're talking about, so if you're talking about just this one here that I pointed out in green, there is only one way to name that ray, and the only way to name it is AB. Because I know that this A is my endpoint and the B is where the ray extends forever in one direction with that B point included. I couldn't switch it around, okay, unless B was my endpoint. Does that make sense? So if I look in the opposite rays, let's look down here. Ray AC and CA are different rays. AC goes to the left, CA goes to the right.
Well, like, what I mean is, can you change the arrow to go, like, opposite way?
No. That's a great question. Because in mathematics, we want to be consistent with our symbols. Okay? And so we have an understanding as math students and mathematicians that whenever I'm labeling an array, it's going to go from left to right. And mathematics, typically you still read that from left to right like you would an English textbook, for example. Like you couldn't say A, B, and point it that way and assume that, and you couldn't make me assume that B is your endpoint, for example. You have to always put it this direction, and what comes first is your endpoint. So if C comes first, that's your endpoint. If B comes second, then that point contains the part of the ray that extends forever. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, cool. Questions? This is a good speed. We're almost done with class. Let's see, do we have time for one more slide? What do you think? You want to stop? Okay, let's stop. We'll pick it up. because I forgot to record, I'm just going to say this again really quickly. The intersection of the figures is a set of points the figures have in common, and then we have two examples, two lines which intersect at a point or can be parallel and never intersect, and planes, which are new, which can intersect in a line, not a point. Let's move on. You do not have to write any of this down, but you are expected to actually do some drawing in geometry because we have to sketch a lot of the shapes that we're talking about. And this is something that is an expectation here that wasn't necessarily an expectation for me before, but you know, it's just going to test a little bit of how these figures sort of work visually in your mind. Okay, so it gives you some tips on how to draw intersecting planes if you're asked to draw a figure that represents some sort of situation. They say draw that vertical plane, which they do in that tan color right there, and then shade or draw a second plane, and then they say shade that plane and then draw a second plane. Remember that those dotted lines represent the part of the plane that goes through that. So if, for example, you had one piece of paper and another piece of paper that went straight through, that's essentially what you're drawing. Does that make sense? It says shade that in a different color and then draw the intersection, which is, of course, a line, line M. Sometimes I find, personally, that if I start with the horizontal plane, it's sometimes easier to draw the figure, but I'm not the best artist, so yeah. Questions on sketching. I'm not going to require you to do some crazy sketching for your test or anything like that. I just want you to be aware that it is an expectation when we're working with figures on homework, for example, and if you're having a hard time, that's okay. This is an art class. I just need to know that you're familiar with the concept. Let's move on. All right, so you try this. Try your best on it. You can ask for help from me or from a neighbor, and then we will go over it. So we're talking about a line and a plane. Sometimes they won't intersect at all, which obviously, if it's clearly not within the plane, then there's no intersection. So when will your line and plane intersect at a point? Your line and plane will intersect at a point if the line goes through the plane. So I'm going to write that down. Line and plane will intersect at points when line goes through plane. Now, when your line is contained within your plane, then they're just going to intersect at a line. Intersect at that line. Line and plane will intersect at the line. Does that make sense? Okay. We're going to have 2 review days too, so if you're feeling a little overwhelmed with the terminology, it's going to be fine. So we've got one more example, and then we'll be done for today. Do you need me to go back? Are we good? Okay, so we're going to look at this molecule, sulfur hexafluoride. So here, the first one says, name 2 different planes that contain line S. It's the same process as the last slide. Now, you don't have to use GI. You can use GH. You can use HI if you want to, because remember, it only takes how many points to name a line? 2. So you don't have to use the ones that are the furthest to the top and the bottom. Does that make sense? So if I wanted to name one plane, I could say GHK, for example. What's another one that contains line S? Yeah, well, not GHI, because those are all collinear, right? Oh, GHL, right, yep, sorry. GHL works as well. Name 3 different planes that contain point K. So point K is right over here. So really, I just have to include point K in the planes that I'm naming. So K, what are 2 other letters? Yeah, K, GH. What's another one? KHL. And then KHI. Yep. That's right. And then it says, name 2 different planes that contain the ray HJ. So that's a little different. I want this ray in particular. So I want this endpoint and this ray. So I'm going to just use HJ and then pick one other letter that's not collinear with it. So what's something else? JH or HJI. What's another example? Yeah, HJK. Yes. Oh, it's on freeze. Sorry. This whole time. My bad. Oh, yeah, you can just yell at me. Okay, so HJI and what was the other one? HJK? All right. That's it for 1.1. Does it make sense to you? Okay, so let's take a look at the summary here. So this is how I look at my summaries as far